In this interview, we're speaking with guitarist Tom Lippincott all about the art and craft of practicing. Tom's a true heavyweight in the world of modern jazz guitar. Based in South Florida, Tom's known for his deep harmonic language, his custom 8-string guitar, and a career that's taken him across the globe. Tom's a guitarist who not only plays with depth, but also teaches it masterfully. So in this interview, we're exploring the meta aspects of practicing. How we create practice routines for ourselves, how we stay motivated, what tools do we use. I've been thinking a lot lately about the early experiences of a new player, when they get the first instrument and what the transition is to where they start to get into more of a structured routine. So what was that like for you, if you remember?
Yeah, before I do that, I just want to say thanks, Greg, for having me here. I'm happy to be here, and
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to talking about this stuff. So yeah, when I was 13, I think back when I was before that, when I was about 12, I used to sneak into my older sister's room and listen to her records. And the stuff that was popular at the time, this was the late 70s. So I remember the Bee Gees and that kind of stuff. And just kind of as a lark, she brought home the Beatles 62 to 66 collection because she had seen them on the Ed Sullivan Show. And at the time, they were kind of like passe, they were like out of style,
Okay.
but it was sort of a nostalgic thing for her. And I put that record on and it was like lightning bolt. I was like, whoa, this is what I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it so much. So I was completely motivated to play the guitar just because of hearing the Beatles. I wanted to do that. And so my earliest experiences practicing were basically just trying to get to the point where I could do what they were doing. So I guess I was self-taught. I was learning out of, Mel Bay chord books and just kind of winging it. I think I remember reading maybe like a music theory book that I found in a library somewhere or something. And I remember being really proud of myself the first time I learned one of George Harrison's solos from on the tune Roll Over Beethoven, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed impossible to me at first. I was like, what,
Sure.
you mean you can actually do that? Like, and then once I could play it, it was like, wow,
Right.
I can actually do this thing that he's doing I
Mm.
play it along with the record and whatever. And that's kind of really how my practice went at first. It was all pretty much, um, inspiration based. I was inspired to learn how to play chords and finger pick, I guess, and play some lead guitar because I wanted to do, what my heroes were doing, the Beatles, and then a little bit later on, Simon and Garfunkel, Bob Dylan. And then once I got more into guitar, it became like Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and Rush. Eddie
Mm.
Van Halen was a big discovery for me. That totally blew my head away, and I
Right.
wanted to play like him then after that. But I don't remember specifically having a real methodical way of doing things. And like I said, the first from 13 to 17, I was completely self-taught, just on my own, figuring stuff out. I was aware, I remember seeing this movie. It was probably a really bad movie, but it was a dramatization of the Beatles' early years.
Okay.
And there is this one scene where they're walking down the street and John Lennon goes over to George Harrison and says, "Let me see those hands." And he goes, just as I thought, your fingers are bleeding. You've been playing too much.
Oh,
And
wow.
I remember thinking, oh, I need to practice so much that my fingers bleed if I want to be able to play like
Wow.
George Harrison. So early on, I was like, yeah, I need to practice as much as possible. And
Wow.
I remember I used to, I'd get home from school, pick up the guitar and play for hours. And after a while, it became a kind of a battle with my parents because my grades were kind of slipping. And I remember at one point they
Mm.
took the guitar away from me and said, you can't get it back until you raise your math grade up or whatever. No.
Like one thing that you said that struck me was when you had that feeling of success in learning the George Harrison solo.
Mhm.
It seems to me, and tell me what you think about this, but like having those kind of wins early on is something that can push you towards starting to take your practicing more seriously, or realizing that this is something that you want to commit to and that yields results?
I think back to when I was first learning and when I first discovered the E minor chord. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. And I remember sitting
Mm.
on my bed just strumming E minor
Right.
for like an hour because it was
And
like,
that's
holy
satisfying
crap,
just doing
where's
that.
this chord been all my life, you
Right,
know?
right.
So, if I can kind of create that experience for somebody.
All right, so let's go now into actually talking about how we can establish a practice routine once we've decided that we're going to do this. We're going to get a little bit more serious and start making a schedule or a routine for ourselves.
Right. So before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about that. I had done a class. It's actually called The Joy of Practicing, and
Mm,
I've taken a couple of the concepts from there to talk about regarding this.
okay.
So in that class, I talk about three different sort of levels of player. One is the professional player or the aspiring professional, the semi-professional, and then the hobbyist. And to me, those are sort of three different approaches. With the professional player, uh, obviously it's the most stringent requirements, right? You want to make a living at this and get to the highest level possible. But
Mm,
one of the specific things that you have to worry about as a professional player is working on stuff for the gigs that you're doing. And that's one of the sort of maybe you could consider almost a downside of being a pro player. I'm sure you yourself have experienced this where, you've got to learn a whole bunch of new tunes for the gig that you have coming up or the tour that
mm,
you have coming up. And oh man, I really want to work on this new concept that am excited about, but I don't have time because I got to
mm,
learn all this music,
right.
whatever. And that's one of the things you have to deal with as a professional player.
Mm,
As a semi-pro player, you have a little more leeway because even though you're doing gigs, you've presumably got some other way to make money as well. And so you can be a little more choosy about what gigs that you do. And a lot of players that go this route end up pursuing exactly what they want to do as a player. I'm only going to do gigs with my own band or whatever it might be because they don't have to depend on, the gigs for being able to pay the rent that month.
mm,
Um, and then finally, the third level is the hobbyist, somebody who's just doing it purely for the joy of it, has no pressure. Maybe sometimes they might want to go to a jam session or get together with other players or whatever. But for the most part, they're purely just they get to work on whatever they feel like working on. There's no pressure. And the reason that I mentioned those three categories is one of the central ideas behind that class is that whichever of those three categories you fall into, I think the most effective way to practice is to have the mindset of the hobbyist. In
mm,
other words, to do it purely for the love of doing it and to try to cultivate that. I mentioned when I first heard the Beatles on a record and that lightning bolt moment. I try never to forget that. I try to always keep that feeling alive in me of that excitement of just, wow, I can't believe I get to do this thing. It's so amazing. I mean, I just think about like how many people that have existed in the history of humankind that never even had that option. And not to mention people that are living in, really horrible circumstances now that
okay.
definitely don't have that. They're just trying to survive from day to day. They don't have the option of, hey, do I want to play guitar? So I find that at least for myself, that's a really effective, maybe more than anything
Mm.
else, sort of way of approaching practicing. And
Yeah. Was there a time when you felt that you had lost motivation in your own practicing, or maybe direction or something, or did it get stale for you at some point?
throughout my 20s, I was very inspired and very serious about music, and I was making my living playing. But I started getting this nagging feeling like I didn't really have my own voice as a musician. I was really into all these different guitar players, and I felt like I could kind of do a bad imitation of Pat Metheny. I could do a bad imitation of Bill Frisell. I could do a bad imitation of Stevie Ray Vaughan, bad imitation
Right.
of Jeff Beck, whatever.
I can do those bad imitations.
And I was like, but there was no unity. It was all
Right.
these different separate compartments. And I started really feeling kind of, depressed about it and discouraged. And I decided I was doing this top 40 gig on the island of Guam in the South Pacific. So it was
Oh
like
wow.
way out in the middle of nowhere. I was there for the
Right.
whole summer.
Wow.
So we were playing, I think, 5 or 6 nights a week. But other than that, I had the entire time to myself. So
Okay.
I practiced more that summer than I probably ever have in my life.
Wow.
And one of the things that I did is I sat down and wrote this long essay about my frustrations with this stuff. And I decided that I wanted to find some wise teacher to talk about this with. And I finally settled on the idea of Mick Goodrick.
Okay.
And I had a friend who lived in Boston. And about 6 months after that, I went and visited him. And I had tried to find how to get in touch with Mick, and it was impossible. He's was like a total hermit.
Mm.
So my friend had gone to New England Conservatory, and so we were there at the school, and John McNeil, who was one of the teachers there,
Mm.
uh, said, I know you know Mick Goodrick. Do you think I could get his phone number from you? And he was like, oh, Mick doesn't like us to give out his phone number ever, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll
Yeah.
call him while you're here and
Mm.
see if he wants to talk to you. So he calls him and
Wow.
says, yeah, I've got a guy here that's from out of town. He's
Right.
desperate to get a lesson with you. You're one of his heroes. And Mick says, can you make it tomorrow at 2? And I was like, yeah, yeah, whatever,
Yeah.
2 a.m., 2 p.m., whatever you want, I'll be there. So
Sure.
I got this lesson with him. I went over to his apartment and I took the essay with me, and I told him this whole story, and he said, well, why don't you read me the essay? So I read the whole thing to him, and he basically he gave me this analogy. He said, imagine that you had a pair of balances, and it's full of pebbles on one side, and your job is to move the pebbles from one side to the other. But you're not allowed to just scoop them up and stick them over on the other side. You have to do it one at a time. He said you could have two different attitudes about this. You could say, "Oh, this is so boring. I can't wait till this is over with and I finally get, this."
Right.
Or you could learn to enjoy the process, look at each individual pebble and see how unique each one is, and
Right.
approach it like a little kid or something.
Wow.
And he said, in your practice in your life, that's basically what it is.
Mm.
And he said, stop being so focused on the end goal and just learn to enjoy the process.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah,
and
that's great. That's great advice.
yeah, I mean, it was
I
like,
mean,
Luke Skywalker going to Yoda kind of felt like. Um, and there was something intangible about just being in the same room with him. I felt like I absorbed some kind of energy that, it
sure.
was weird.
Yeah.
And I truly felt like, in the year or so after that, very gradually, I did, without me even doing anything about it, start to feel like my own voice started to emerge. And the other sort of revelation that I had after I thought about this whole balance thing is I think what he was talking about is when the balance gets all the way from one side to the other, that's basically when you die.
Mm.
And your journey as a musician is only over when you die, right?
Right.
I mean, it's not like a video game where we're going to get to a point, oh, we finished guitar.
Sure. Sure.
Now we
We
got to
never
get,
finish.
I break my practice down into 9 different categories.
Okay.
And I'll just read them off really quickly. Technique, 1; 2, note recognition slash reading; 3, rhythm; 4, ear training; 5, listening and transcription; 6, repertoire; 7, harmony slash chord voicing slash comping; 8, improvisation; and 9, composition. And
Okay.
going back to the first one, technique, that's to me, and I think for most guitar players, that's the logical place to start as kind of a way to
Okay.
warm up and get into a practice state of mind. And something that I sort of took from a friend of mine who's a classical guitarist, I remember him telling me we were talking about struggles with tendonitis that we had both had, and he said, "Yeah, I've noticed that whenever I don't practice really slow scales at the beginning of my practice session, the tendonitis starts to come back."
Mm.
And I had been kind of struggling with some wrist issues at the time, so oh, I'll try that. So I started playing major scales really super slow, and up until that point, my warm up had always been like, let me try and work up as fast as I can. You know,
Sure.
I'd start somewhat slow and then like 16th notes. I
Right.
had one of
Right.
those boss doctor beats that go ticka, 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 ticka,
Hmm.
ticka, and I'd like speed it, speed it, speed it, speed it, try to get as fast as I could. But I'm just going to try to stay relaxed and play really super slow. And oddly enough, after a half hour of doing that, I felt more warmed up than I ever did, where I was trying to get faster and faster.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, another one of my heroes is Ben Monder,
Hmm.
and he's got an instructional video where he talks about putting a metronome on this insanely slow tempo, like
Oh yeah.
11 beats per minute or something like
Yeah.
that,
I think I've
and
seen
then
that. Yeah.
playing, yeah, and then he'll just like play one note,
Right.
and then he does all this crazy stuff with polyrhythms over that. But so I was like, oh, if Ben thinks it's cool, then it must be
Right.
good.
It's
So
legit.
so I that's one of several things that I do to warm
Okay.
up. I don't do that every day, but at least maybe once a week or so, I'll run through really slow scales. I'll put the metronome maybe on around 20 beats per minute, and I'll just play up and down, in my case, a 4 octave scale because I've got the extra range on my instrument.
Okay.
And depending on how much time I have and how much I feel like doing it, I might run through all the common scales that way. And the whole little routine takes about a half hour if I do that.
Okay.
But I don't always have the patience to do it. And there's other things that I might do instead. Maybe just run some arpeggios or scale patterns or some Bach violin pieces. You know, I try to mix it up a little bit to keep it interesting. So I'm not feeling like I have to do this today.
Right. It sounds like that kind of both physically gets the blood flowing a little, connecting you with the instrument, and also maybe slowing you down and bringing your
Mhm.
focus. Yeah.
I forgot to mention that before,
Yeah.
is that I'm also a big fan of meditation. That's
Okay.
something that I've been doing for years. And I feel like that sort of practice with the guitar is very meditative, just playing those slow scales.
Mm.
But also from a real practical standpoint, what I've noticed is if I'm playing that slowly, I really have time to focus on every little motion that I'm doing. I can
Mm.
make sure that my left hand is really efficient. My fingers are staying close to the frets. Everything's staying relaxed. I can make sure that my uh, right hand finger picks the string at exactly the same instant that my left hand finger comes down. And I've noticed that, you know, even if I'm playing a really slow scale, the actual motion of doing this is just as quick as it is if I'm playing fast. So the only difference is how close those notes are
Right.
together. And
Yeah.
I find that's been really helpful for my technique as well.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah. It's funny how even when you're playing slow, what you're talking about, that focus, it just pulls your confidence and your technique together. It's like
Mhm.
that exactness kind of thing.
Mhm.
I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, for sure.
Like we were talking about before, you have the professional musician who's got
Mhm.
repertoire to learn and things like that. And at least when I've had a gig, that's almost been like a great thing because that tells me, okay, I need to practice these tunes. I know what I
Mhm.
need to practice. But sometimes when I don't have that, I'm just sort of left adrift. Do you have any advice about maybe figuring out what you need to prioritize now?
I think that really depends on the individual. It depends on what your goals are. And I think that is probably something for the intermediate student to make sure that they have a clear idea of is what do you foresee yourself wanting to do with this stuff long term? Do you want to be a Thelonious Monk
Mm-hmm.
where you have a really distinctive personal voice, but a lot of people aren't going to hire you? You
Okay.
know, are you familiar with Kenny Werner and
Sure.
his whole effortless
Yeah.
mastery thing? I was
Yeah.
going to talk about that in a little while anyway,
Yeah.
because I'm a
Yeah.
fan of that.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a funny quote where he said, Thelonious Monk could never win the Thelonious Monk piano competition.
Mm. Right. I hear that. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Because
he's that's
it's
kind of an extreme example of some, that's the
if you
first
don't
person I
have
think.
like the blistering chops,
Right, and
Yeah.
just like general skills of being able to cover all different styles
Right.
and whatever, being a consummate professional
Mm.
musician that can fit into any situation. Thelonious Monk wasn't that. He was this
Right.
amazing genius who took this unique thing about himself to this amazing level,
Mm.
but he definitely wasn't a guy that you would call as a sideman for a
Right.
touring gig. And then at the other extreme, you have somebody maybe that wants to be a session musician. Their main like you mentioned Dan Warner,
Mm.
a mutual friend of ours.
Right.
He became
Yeah.
what he was my student when I was a TA at UM.
Okay.
And I remember like he was 18 years old and he was already the best sight reader at the school, hands down. Like he
Yeah.
could blow anybody out of the water. And he wanted to be a studio guy. That was his goal.
Right.
He knew it from an early age. That's
Mm.
what he wanted to do. And so he really focused on that, made sure he was an amazing reader. He really focused on like having great technique and rhythm and being able to execute things perfectly. Um, I remember, when I was his teacher, one of the things that I would harp on him about was when he would play jazz, it would sound kind of stiff and stilted because he'd spent so much time being really precise
Right.
and I remember making him transcribe John Coltrane's melody statement on this ballad where he plays really free and
Okay.
stuff. And then I remember like walking down the hall in the Foster building and hearing this amazing rock player. Is Steve Vai here at the school doing a workshop or something?
Mm.
And I look in the window and it's Dan. I'd never
Right.
heard him in his element before. I was like, wow, he's
Yeah. I was always
amazing.
blown away by him and his chops and everything.
Yeah.
Back in the day when I used to see him.
But that's what he ended up doing. He became the studio guy in Miami for years and years.
Right. Right. With pop music, you can learn parts like straight off the record if you want, and you can play them back sort of verbatim on the gig. But when we're talking about jazz and improvising musicians, how does the nature of what we have to practice change?
Well, a very kind of popular thing is to say music is a language, and I think it's very true. Just by the same token that you and I are communicating, we both are fluent in the English language, and so we're able to just think of an idea and open our mouths, and hopefully something coherent comes out,
Right.
and we're talking back and forth and having a conversation. And if I get fluent enough in music and in a particular idiom of music like jazz, I can hopefully have that same thing happen where I can communicate on a purely intuitive level because I've got the nuts and bolts of the vocabulary so under my fingers and in my ears, just like I do with the English language, that I can just open my mouth or put the guitar in my hands and start playing, and something will come out that
Right.
makes sense and that will be able to communicate with other musicians that are fluent in that style. Something that I have done a fair amount of is taught students who are already experienced guitar players but don't have much experience either playing jazz or in some cases improvising at all. And one of the first things I like to do with students, and this also kind of descends from Mick Goodrick, is having them map the notes out on one string at a time. I'll just take the C major scale and like start on the B string and play, C, D, E, F, G, A, B,
Mm.
C and play up and down. Okay, now you know where those notes are. You're only allowed to play on that string for right now. Now improvise to this backing track or this vamp or whatever
Okay.
and play a melody and start improvising. And if, occasionally if I get a student that's like only maybe played classical or whatever, and they're kind of like a deer on the headlights, then I'll try to start really simple and, play, maybe combine the notes in a different way or play, some slow notes and then some faster notes or,
Okay.
whatever. But that's one of the things I found that can be effective to get people, A, learning the notes on the fingerboard, but also improvising and being melodic about it, because I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks for guitar players in general is we have this grid under our
Mm.
fingers, and you're taught to, oh yeah, okay, you have to learn this scale, the pentatonic scale or the major scale, up and down, up and
Right.
down, up and down. And people get into this, one of the big questions that teachers get is when I improvise, I feel like it just sounds like I'm playing scales. How do I break out of that?
Eventually, let's say somebody wants to be like more of a bebop improviser. So there's a more of a
Right.
particular language, right?
So for me, that step, something that was really important for me was transcription.
Okay.
You know, I transcribed a lot of solos, and at first it was more about ear training and actually learning notation too. I'd get better at my notation writing and reading by writing out these solos, but I would start to be able to hear better. And then eventually, I kind of felt like it wasn't affecting my playing all that much, and that became a little bit frustrating. But I realized that I hadn't really learned very many of the solos, to play them along with the recording the way that I had when I was learning to play rock. Like I remember learning Jimmy Page's solo on Stairway to Heaven, or Roger Water or
Right.
David Gilmour's solo on Comfortably Numb, stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that, and they
Sure.
playing it along with the record and really learning a lot from doing that. I thought, well, I should do the same thing with jazz. So I took a solo and learned it and to practice it for months until I got to where I could play it along with the recording. And before that time, I had just kind of like I'd taken one isolated lick out of a solo and tried to, play it in different places on the fingerboard or whatever. But I had this frustration where, okay, here comes a place where I can play that lick. It'll be perfect right here. And then I
Right.
usually screw it up. But even if on the rare case where I got it right, it wouldn't sound like it fit with all the other stuff. Here's all this
Okay.
lame Tom Lippincott stuff. Wes Montgomery lick. Okay, back to the lame Tom Lippincott stuff. And, and
Right. Sounded
the
kind of out
first,
of place. It sounded good,
yeah,
but it didn't. It didn't
right.
flow with the
Didn't
context of the
make
rest
any
of the thing.
sense with what came before, what came after.
So is
And
that is
so
that what you mainly got out of transcribing the whole thing? Was the sense of how
learning the
to?
whole solo was I found that over a long period of time, little bits and pieces of that solo were coming out in my playing in a much more organic way. I
Okay.
wasn't even aware of it. I'd play something and be like, oh, that thing that I just played was a lick from that solo. Maybe I
Okay.
didn't play it exactly the same, but or maybe
Right.
even something less pin downable, like the time feel, or the
Right.
whether I picked a note or did a hammer on or a pull off or whatever. I was getting that stuff from doing. One thing I do think is important to note is that was my experience, and I don't necessarily think that when I'm teaching a student that something that worked for me is automatically going to work for everybody. One thing that really floored me when I took that lesson with Mick Goodrick is I asked him about transcription, and he said, I think it's kind of overrated. I transcribed one McCoy Tyner solo and one Chick Corea solo, and that's it. That's all I've ever done. So I was
Right.
I was actually really taken aback because everybody I'd ever talked to up until that point had been like, transcription, transcription, that's the way.
Right. So you
So
realize he had like a different way of getting there.
yeah,
Yeah, that's kind of my sort of takeaway from his book too. The Advancing Guitarist, I think it's
advancing,
called.
yeah.
It's just like I'm not going to tell you what method to use.
Hmm.
You get. I'm
You
just
got to
going
figure
to
it out
kind of give you
yourself,
some nuggets of inspiration. But you got to
right?
figure out how you. And I mean, I like that approach. It seems like though you have to be a little bit more ready for that. You
Mm.
have to be
Yeah,
a little bit more advanced than just a beginner. In order to do that.
right.
So still to this day, your method is basically working on entire solos, transcribing entire solos.
Well, yes and no. I mean, what I would add to that is I feel like as I've gotten, the more experience I got, the easier it was to take little snippets of things and know what to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
If I learn a lick now, it's not going to be the same thing as when I was 18 and played that West lick and it sounded out of place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes that'll happen, but I've gotten better at being able to take a little bit of information and processing it with my own thing and incorporating it in a little more organically. So, yeah, sometimes I will just learn a lick or learn a chord voicing or whatever it is, a little passage with counterpoint with, whatever. And I feel like it's a little easier for me to now incorporate that stuff. I also think that in recent years, I've gravitated more and more toward maybe almost the Mick Goodrick approach of trying to invent my own stuff versus verbatim taking stuff from recordings. I still
Mhm.
listen to recordings and listen to people live and get inspired by it, but I don't find myself as much, okay, now I'm going to figure out what that thing was.
Okay.
I do it sometimes, but I find for the most part now it's mostly let's see if I can take the big picture of what inspired me about that solo or that lick or whatever and come up with my own concept and
Right.
not even figure out what it was specifically so that it'll be a little bit more of my own.
Okay. Let's say that like you do want to integrate, maybe it's something based on a pattern, or some kind of intervallic thing or something like that. You want to ingest it, you want it to stick around and show up in your playing.
Well, I do find that it seems to take a long time for any given concept that I'm working on to work its way into my playing to the point where I'm not forcing it anymore. It's just coming out. Um, but one thing, and I think I may have maybe sort of was doing this before, but the guitarist Miles Okazaki.
Uh-huh.
Um, he's got this book called The Fundamentals of Guitar. I've just barely scratched the surface of digging into that book, but I really like it. He's another guy that's got a very unique kind of concept and way of looking at
He did a
things.
lot of monk stuff,
And
didn't he? Didn't he do a whole?
yeah, yeah, he did a
Yeah.
record of every monk composition
Wow.
on solo guitar. But he put out a few videos in conjunction with this book, and one of the things he talked about is learning scale patterns. And he said, I try not to play the same one over and over too much because I don't want to bake that specific pattern into my fingers so that when I improvise, it's just going to come out like da
Mm.
da 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 da,
Right.
whatever,
Okay.
playing in thirds or whatever. There's so many different, almost infinite number of combinations of notes that you could play, and I sort of have started taking that approach and this goes back to working on technique stuff. When I first pick up the guitar to warm up or whatever, I might just pick a pattern and I might pick one that I've never done before. I'll see if I can come up with something new, a new way of combining the notes that I've never done and just
Mhm.
play through that. And then the next day I'll come up with a different one.
Okay.
Something I've been trying to get the harmonic major scale more under my fingers. And one thing that's been a real challenge is just playing up and down the diatonic seventh chords of that. So that is something
Mhm.
that I've sort of done over and over again. I keep coming back to it because I keep screwing it up every time I do it. But but generally speaking, if I'm working on stuff, a set of notes, a scale or whatever that I'm more have under my fingers, I'll try not to do too much of the same
Yeah.
repetitive pattern over and over again because I don't want that to be reflected in my improvisation. I want
Wow.
to try to keep things a little bit more spontaneous.
In what you're talking about, you're sort of creating new things often, and then abandoning them. But in doing so, you're kind of like getting your fingers used to various pathways, on the guitar, which frees you up, in a way
Yeah.
to go in different places. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little bit more interested in the kind of Jim Hall approach of, being an
Mhm.
idea-based improviser versus a lick-based improviser.
Yeah.
With all that said, I'm pretty shameless in, playing the stuff that I have under my fingers that I've been playing for a long time.
Mm.
I'll definitely not hesitate to make use of that. It's not like every solo is a brand new composition of stuff that I've never done before.
Right.
I find that there's sort of three different ways that you can organize practice time. The first way is the first thing that somebody told me was to make a schedule.
Okay.
Okay, I have 2 hours to practice, so I'm going to do 20 minutes of technique, 30 minutes of learning this new tune,
Mm.
20 minutes of improvising, half hour of whatever.
Okay.
You have this whole very specific schedule. So
Right.
I tried doing that when I was, 16, 18, whatever, and I always failed miserably. And it wasn't because I was lazy and I'd get distracted, whatever. What happened was I would get inspired by one specific thing that I was working on and go off on that. And
Hmm.
next thing I knew, oh, it's time to go to class or it's time to go eat dinner or whatever. And oh man, I didn't get to any of the other things on the list. I
Okay.
suck. I'm a failure. And after that happening enough times, I started thinking, well, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world because I am learning stuff. I'm making progress. It's just that I get so focused on one specific thing, get inspired by it, and I can't help myself but, get off on that tangent and go for it.
Right.
So eventually I came up with sort of a less rigid way of approaching that. I made myself what I called a master list.
Okay.
And basically what this is I wrote down every possible thing that I could think of that I felt like I needed to or wanted to work on in my playing for the rest of my life.
Oh, wow.
Categorize, like number one, number two, A, B, C, different
And are these
subcategories.
like how specific are these? Are they more like categories of things, or are they like very
It
specific?
was about four computer printed pages.
Oh, wow.
So a
It's a
lot
lot.
of, I mean, big broad categories and then a lot of subcategories underneath that. I got as specific as I could think of and
Yeah.
I added to it over time. And I would just keep that on my music stand when I practiced. And inevitably what happened was if my interest was flagging or my, focus was going away, my eye would stray toward that paper and I would see something on there and be like, oh, that's right. Yesterday when I was falling asleep, I was just thinking that I need to work on playing giant steps and 12 keys. That's right. And off I go.
Wow. That's great. That's
And
a great
now
idea. Yeah.
in recent years, I've sort of amended, I still have it somewhere, that
Mm.
master list. But now what I do is I make more short-term lists. I'll have like this summer, this fall, this winter, this spring of stuff that I want to do and work on. And I just keep it on my computer desktop.
So
And
it's
a lot of
it's
times I don't even need to look at it. I'll just, I write it down and I know it's there and then I'll keep it in mind or whatever. And then finally, the third thing, and this was something that I actually got from one of my students, is I had this student who was really struggling. He did I think it was his junior recital, and they failed him. And they said, you got to do it over again. At FIU, where this was, if you make a second attempt at a recital and you failed out, then you get kicked out of school. So he was really like, oh God, I really need to step up.
yeah.
And what he did is he made himself a practice journal. So he
Okay.
every week would, or every practice day, he would write everything that he worked on every day. And then at the end of the week, he'd sort of look back and assess everything he worked on. And that would help keep him focused. And it really seemed to work well for him. And he did
Okay.
great on his next junior recital and graduated. And, he's teaching now. But I've never really done that myself, but when I saw how useful it was for him, I've suggested that to other students before too.
I mean, all these ways, to me seem totally like valid, just depending on the person and maybe where
Yeah,
where you're at in
exactly.
your
And
style.
speaking of that, I had
Yeah.
another student at FIU a few years ago who was an ex-Marine.
Okay.
And he was so like dependent on
Yeah.
schedule. Like, I gave him that whole spiel and he just couldn't, he needed a schedule
Yeah.
I mean, he scheduled everything in his life, But for him, the having that
Yeah.
really rigid schedule was perfect. He felt weird without having that.
The scheduled thing I did, myself at a certain time, and I found it was effective, for, I think for like a summer, I really had that kind of rigid
Mm.
schedule. But I love the idea about just the master list, because there are so many things, right, that they're floating in your mind and you think you're going to remember to get to them,
Right.
but you don't.
Exactly.
Is time feel something that can be practiced and developed? I mean, I feel like obviously it can be to a certain extent, but is there some kind of uh, cutoff to maybe somebody's ability to have like an amazing feel?
I think to a certain extent, maybe the way you put it is probably the best way to put it is there is a cutoff. Here, check this out. My I've had shaky
Okay.
fingers my whole life, and the older I get, the worse it gets.
Okay.
And I feel like that's the biggest frustration for me with my time and my feel is my physical ability to be accurate because my hands are so shaky, I feel like I can almost never get exactly what I have in my head to come out exactly placed in the exact moment I want it to be placed.
Okay.
Plus, I'm left-handed, so but I play right-handed. So my right
Oh.
hand, which is the rhythm producer, has always been my weakest thing.
Oh wow.
So I'm kind of behind the eight ball with that. And I always knew that rhythm was a weak point. Now, I guess rhythm and feel are related things, maybe not exactly the same thing, but I do think it would be worth spending a little bit
Mm-hmm.
of time talking about rhythm specifically
Yeah.
for this discussion. Um, but all I really knew to do was to say how important it is. Yeah, rhythm is the most important thing. Okay, and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And I really didn't know any other thing to do. Um, and I started getting more and more interested in getting better with my rhythm and trying to see if there was some way that I could work on it in the same way that I worked on melodic stuff and harmonic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I was in New York in 2006, and I took a lesson from Ari Honig, the drummer.
Oh, okay.
And he kind of raked me over the coals because
Really?
he said, "Okay, let's play a little bit."
Uh,
And so we started playing, and he had me play at some different tempos. First, he started like a medium, real like slow medium, and then gradually sped it up.
mm,
And then he kind of stopped and said, "Well, when you play chords, everything feels good, but as soon as you start playing single note lines, your time goes out the window. You're rushing like crazy. I can barely even play with you." And I was just like, and this wasn't, like I wasn't like an 18-year-old kid. I was like, I think I turned 40 that year. So it really, for a second, I was like, holy crap, man,
okay.
I have to reassess this whole thing. But he gave me some exercises that were really good. The first thing he did is he said, okay, I'm going to start playing a swing groove. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And it said, I want you to improvise to it, but you're only allowed to play upbeats. I
Oh
was like,
wow.
oh, okay, sounds easy. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I played like one note and he stopped. No, that was a downbeat. Oh, shit. So, okay, let's try it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. I
Right.
played two notes. Oh, the second note was a downbeat. And it really was eye-opening for me because I had gone my whole life not being aware of when I was playing upbeats and downbeats. I
Mm,
just had, just trusted intuition for that and had
yeah.
never thought about it, studied it, anything. So one of the first things that I did after that lesson was I started just taking one and of one, two and of two, three and of two, four and of four. Well, I think I did said that wrong, but you know what I mean. And just isolating each one of those and getting a feel for what each one sounded like and felt like. The end of two sounds different than the end of three. It feels different.
Mm,
The end of four sounds different. They each have their own vibe and their own color, like a major and a minor chord do. And I feel like I'm still at the very beginning of getting this stuff together, but I feel like, I've finally made some progress with rhythm and being able to work on it in a little bit more of an organized way. Um, and then furthermore, I can't recommend this stuff enough. Ari has this series of classes on what's that, My Music Masterclass, that
mm,
website I think it's just called rhythm training or something, and I think there's like four of them. And the basic concept is he just has you tap the beats with your foot, sing a melody, and tap out a particular rhythm with your hands, and you have to do all this stuff at the same time and
okay.
sync everything up. And he starts out really simple, and then what you're tapping with your hands gets more and more complicated. Like, tapping groups of five where you're only accenting the first and third of each five, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And actually, I found these exercises to be so helpful for me that when I was teaching at FIU, I would have my guitar ensemble students do these exercises as part of class. And I found that guitar players at FIU went from kind of having the reputation of being the players that were the least good at rhythm to kind of being like the rhythm people. Anyway, but I feel like getting more focused and more specific with practicing rhythm has helped me to be able to develop a feel better because I have a better intuitive grasp of where the specific is of the rhythm and how I can play around with that and change it. If I am laying back or whatever, I have a little bit more of a specific idea of it and not just, oh, it feels this way or
Yeah.
whatever.
The question I had was about giving yourself feedback when you're practicing. For example, just recording yourself, an audio track of yourself, or maybe videoing yourself with your phone, getting that feedback for yourself, and how you can go about constructively critiquing yourself to make improvements, and know what you need to practice and focus on.
So, I that teacher Jack Peterson in North Texas that I mentioned, he used to say that the tape recorder is the truth machine, and that's always stuck with me. And I have amended that to there's two truth machines. There's the metronome and the recorder.
Mm-hmm.
Because, not really a tape recorder anymore, but the phone memo or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I find both of those to be incredibly useful. So, we were just talking about rhythm, and the metronome is essential for having a measuring stick against what you're playing.
Yeah.
And I also find that in addition to just having the metronome as a steady beat keeper, it's really essential to have, for example, have a metronome set up to where it gives you beat one of a measure of four, so that, if you're improvising to it, you don't lose where beat one is. Or if you do, you know that you've lost it. And the same thing if you're working on keeping a form, I have a bunch of metronomes setups where like a 12 bar form or a 32 bar form, and I'm playing, let's say, a blues and the metronome has like a cymbal crash that happens on beat one every 12 bars.
Wow.
And then if I'm trying some crazy rhythmic thing and I get off, I'll know right away because the cymbal crash happened at the wrong time, and I know the
Right.
metronome didn't screw it up.
So you're taking
So
over
that,
really the responsibility for the timekeeping.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's one, sort of feedback that I get is
Mm-hmm.
from the metronome. But then, yeah, the recording is the other truth machine. And interestingly enough, I mean, I think we typically think that when we record ourselves, we're going to hear all the bad stuff and be able to correct it. And that's totally true. That's one of the main things that's useful about it. But the other thing is hearing the positive things. I've noticed this is so strange that the way this happens so often is I'll record a gig and on the gig I'll be thinking, man, I'm sucking. This is the worst solo I've ever played. Ugh. And when I listen back to this recording, I'm gonna be just rolling my eyes and then a couple of days later I'll listen back and be like, wow, this sounds pretty good. What was I thinking?
You're right.
And then the opposite will happen. I'll be like, yeah, I'm burning. Wait till I hear this back. I'm gonna be, this is gonna be so
Yeah.
great. And then I listen back. I'm like, this sucks. Why did I think this was so good?
Right.
And one of the things that has led me to realize is that music is such a complicated process that when I'm all the stuff, that is going on in my head, all the neurons that are firing, I don't have very much left to be an objective judge of what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was younger, I always thought I sucked. And somebody would come up to me at the end of a set and be like, "Oh, you sounded good." And in my head, I'd be going, "What an idiot. I can't believe they think I sound good." They must not know anything about music if they thought that sounded good.
Right.
And then I thought back to all those times of like, maybe they knew something I didn't, you know. I mean, maybe there were times where somebody didn't know what they were talking about. But maybe there are other times where to them, I really sounded good, and it was just all this stupid stuff in my head, neurotic things, you know, judging myself and how bad
Right.
I sound, whatever. And so it's taught me to be a little bit more forgiving of myself too. That, you
Sure.
know, if if I feel like I'm playing badly, that may or may not be true. And that person out in the audience may have a completely different experience than what I'm experiencing in my head. It might be the most meaningful thing,
Yeah.
might change their life.
Ex-
The thing that
exactly.
I was like, oh, that was stupid. Why did I play that? And they're going, oh man, I want to be a musician after hearing that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Transitioning from your sound in the practice room to the bandstand.
Oh.
I don't know about you, but there are different situations where the sound can really be like the devil to
Hmm.
your whole game.
Absolutely.
You know, at one point I was almost thinking, you know, maybe I should spend more time practicing with a really unreasonable sound. Right? You know, because when you're
Yeah.
practicing, you're sort of you know, you dial your sound up to how it's nice and warm and, you know,
Hmm.
echoey just like you like. You can't
Right.
always control that, right? When you go out
Yeah,
into the real world.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I will do sometimes is my eighth string has a piezo pickup on it. And when I'm practicing, sometimes I'll dial that in to get a real bright sound so that I can
Mm,
really hear if something's, you know, my attack is not controlled or whatever. And that feels like a little more honest than when I go to my nice warm
okay.
pillowy sound that I love.
So
And
what
I
I'm
can,
saying isn't completely unreasonable.
yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely don't think so. And man, when I was in my 20s, I mentioned, you know, like sometimes I get so depressed that I just wanted to quit, whatever. And a lot of times it was exactly the thing you're talking about. I'd like be at home and come up with this beautiful tone, and wow, wait till the guys on the gig hear this. This is going to be so amazing. I get to the gig and it sounds like total crap, just because, you know, the
Right.
symbols are interfering, the cash
Yeah.
registers, you know, whatever. It just
Yeah.
everything goes out the window, and it sounds terrible, and I feel like I just can't play at all, and I come off the gig and just, oh God, I just want to quit. It's not even worth it. Just want to dump all my gear into the ocean. And what I finally found is that because that was happening, I would react to it and I would get tense. And that would make it even worse because then I start picking too hard and, you know, everything would start getting out of control. And so what I decided to start doing is when I was in my happy place at home at 2 o'clock in the morning with the sounds perfect, say, instead of concentrating on the way this sounds, let me concentrate on the way this feels physically. Like imagine I couldn't hear at all and I was
Right.
just, you know, playing and noticing the way it
Hmm.
feels when I'm comfortable and relaxed, and almost like see if I can make a mental snapshot of the way this feels right now. And then when I get on the gig and all hell breaks loose and the drummer's playing way too loud and whatever, take a deep breath, call up
Yeah.
that snapshot, relax. Okay, this is what it felt like when I was in my bedroom playing and I was all comfortable.
Does that
And
work?
it's not like a miracle cure or anything, but I just found that it made things way better. And I felt like my sound immediately got better when I was able to relax and not be so uptight and tense and worried about it.
Let's talk about now from the perspective of the teacher how you approach providing like discipline for a student in terms of structuring their practice routine versus finding their own inner motivation and almost letting them lead the way. What's your approach there?
Well, I definitely tend to go toward or to lean toward the more Mick Goodrick kind of way of approaching things, where I feel like it's up to me as the teacher to show them the stuff, and then okay, now you figure out your way of working with it. Now, I'm not nearly as much of a taskmaster as he is, where it's like, okay, here, here's the stuff, you go do it, and it's your problem now, kind of. It almost seems like that's kind of the Mick Goodrick approach.
Mm.
I'm definitely there to bounce stuff off of along the way. Okay, so this didn't work. What if you try this or whatever? But I don't have a very specific, like, regimented thing of this is how you should practice or this is what you should do. I try to look at it like every student's going to be different, and I figure it out with them. I feel like it's like a doctor, like, making a prescription.
Right.
You look at the individual patient and say, what is their specific need? What needs to be prescribed? I do have a bunch of material that I use with almost everyone at some point or another, some fundamental things. But I don't always do it in the same order, and I don't always do all that stuff with everybody. It depends on their interest and their abilities. When I was teaching college level students, of course, they had to have, they had to do a jury every semester, and
Right.
there were requirements that the school had. So we had to make sure we covered certain things. But if I'm just teaching students outside of the school setting, I'm a lot more loose with it and just, whatever the student's interested in, I'm here to do my best to guide you through that.
Maybe touch upon like what do you feel a private teacher brings that you're missing if you solely just try to go looking on YouTube at various videos.
Yeah, it's kind of, in a way, it's almost the opposite of the way we came up. You know,
Mm,
with us, it was like this legendary information that we heard,
yeah.
some friend of a friend of a friend has this book, or
Or the
like has a
videotape where they
video,
caught
and
it. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, totally.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like you have to be Indiana Jones and like search for
Yeah.
it, and it's this rare gem that you find this
Which
new
is also
information.
very, very fun in a way.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know?
The search was half the fun, and sometimes. And now it's the opposite. You just get
Right.
this, like, dump of information of everything in the whole universe.
Right.
And, there was some famous science fiction author that said 90% of everything is crap or something like that. And that definitely holds true with the internet, maybe more than 90%.
Mhm.
So you kind of, for somebody that's just starting out, it's really hard to know, like, what's the good stuff and what's the stuff that's useless.
Yeah.
So that's one way that I think having the guidance of somebody, whether it's a teacher or just somebody more experienced, is pretty essential almost especially for a complete beginner.
Right.
And then the main thing to me that really is not covered by even the best instructional material that's available online or from websites or whatever, is the feedback that you get from a teacher.
Mm.
I mentioned before the
Right.
thing about a doctor making a prescription,
Yeah.
you're not going to get a prescription or a treatment plan from
Right.
a YouTube video.
And
Uh,
definitely not like one tailor made for you and
right,
what you
exactly.
need, at the moment.
So I think that really is the big thing that is missing from just, learning from watching videos, is getting that feedback.
Tell us about your own materials. I know you have like 40 something videos with Mike's masterclass. Just talk a little bit about where people can find you, you know.
Yeah, my website is pretty easy to find as long as you know how to spell my name, just Tom at tomlippincott.com, basically. And really that's pretty much everything else you might want to link out to is on there. So my
Okay.
YouTube channel is linked to on there. Mike's master classes, who I've been with since 2009, I think. That there's links to all those classes on there.
And you're still offering private lessons now, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I teach remotely. So, anywhere somebody is, I can teach them. And actually, once my wife and I start van life, I plan to continue teaching remotely. We're
Okay.
going to have high-speed internet in our van. So I'm as long as everything goes according to plan, I
Yeah.
should still be able to teach as many students as I can book while we're in the
That
van.
sounds fun.
I also have recordings of my music. As a matter of fact, in exactly a week from today, I'm going into the studio with my quartet and we're going to record a new album. So I'm really excited. I've got a bunch of new
Wow.
compositions that I've recorded. I
Fun.
mentioned Dave Fernandez.
Okay.
He and I have been playing together for years and years, and so he's playing on it. And then
Mm,
great a young bass player and drummer named Marty Quinn on bass and Lucas Apostolaris on drums. But they're both really great up and coming younger musicians. I mean, they're in their 30s. They're not that young, but
to
relatively
us, they
speaking.
are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention is I really appreciate the fact that we had such an in-depth discussion because in this day and age, when people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter
Yeah.
and shorter, and everything's about, the 10-second sound bite and
Totally.
the TikTok, this and that, maybe I'm the Don Quixote of the internet, but I'm really fighting to bring back attention spans. And I purposely don't cut the length of my videos, and I don't make YouTube shorts or anything.
Right.
I'm maybe I'm railing against windmills with the lance or whatever, but I appreciate the fact that you're willing to do a
Right.
deep dive, and whoever's willing to watch a longer video, that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, great.
All right. Well, with that being said, totally appreciate it, all the time that you're given,
Okay.
and we'll sign off from here.
Okay,
All right.
great.